the virtual safety car is going to end in a really terrible place for George Russell. And when is he going to drop the hammer? Aitken pulling alongside so he can accelerate when he needs to. And we're back racing once again. Russell's going to get swallowed. First by Hubert, and now with the car that we're on board with, Russell could find himself down in third position. They're 3 wide down the iconic main straight at Monza, and Aitken has gone from third to first. He's now defending. Hubert has to come out of it, and Russell's going to try and retake the lead around the outside, but it's Aitken.
This is not a clip of a Formula One race. No, this soundbite comes from the 2017 GP3 feature race at Monza. And we're hearing the top 3 runners in that race battle after a virtual safety car restart.
Getting very close together. Aitken knows it as they go through the fastest turn on this racetrack. That's Curva Grande. He'll have to hug the inside line. Does Russell dare go around the outside into the second chicane, the Della Roja? No, he's going to try and hope that he can switch back this time and with the greater momentum accelerate away and try and pressure him. This is where the ARTs crashed a year ago, and they're so close to doing so again.
The championship leader, George Russell, is racing with his ART teammates and close championship competitors Jack Aitken and Antoine Hubert, and it's just hair-raising.
He belongs to Jack Aitken, but for how much longer? As we go into the latter stages, Aitken knows he needs to defend the 2 title protagonists going side by side. Who is going to be able to break latest? It's still Aitken with the inside line. It's still Aitken with the lead, but for how much longer? Because his teammate is pressuring him all the way through. Aitken just about hanging on. He's going to have to go tight to the inside line. He's going to it's the outside now, but it turns into the inside.
Even rewatching this clip for the umpteenth time since the race was run, I still get a fizzy feeling and a big stupid grin on my face as I watch these guys duke it out. This is just one of several Formula racing series outside of Formula One that's run regularly throughout the racing season. If you're a real motorsport fanatic and you haven't been watching these series, you're seriously missing out. Today, we jump in the deep end of the lower formulas, or formulae if you're being grammatically correct. We'll run down the tiers of the Formula Racing pyramid, talk about the cars being raced, by who, all of that. And next week, we'll have a look at how a driver gets a seat to the Formula One team by moving through these tiers. And before we begin, a big thanks to the F1 Feeder Series subreddit. There's a ton of great information out there, and it came in handy while producing this episode, so check it out if you're interested. This is Garagista Radio. Thanks for tuning in.
Second, and Villeneuve got incredible. Villeneuve stood on everything, locked up his tyres, got the line, and he's back into second position on the last lap but 1, and the French crowd aren't very happy.
Before we get into the individual racing series, I think it's worth having a brief overview of Formula Racing in general. Formula Racing is pretty much any form of open-wheeled, single-seater motorsport series that's regulated at least in part by the FIA. The Formula name comes from the FIA's single-seater regulation nomenclature for the post-World War II racing series it regulated, where cars that competed in a particular series fell under a particular formula. Cars that followed the Formula One regulations became known as Formula One cars, same for Formula 2, and so on. Of course, there was pre-World War II racing that's considered analogous to Formula 1 and the Grand Prix Motor Racing series, which eventually would morph into F1. The Grand Prix name, of course, stuck, and now every Formula 1 race is the Grand Prix of whatever country is hosting. The cars were similar too, with manufacturers like Alfa Romeo and Benz, who bore the colors of their country of origin. When the FIA established the World Championship for the first time in 1950, the formula only really applied to the size of the engine that could be used, but would later come to include car weight, size, and all other matter of specification on the cars. Alright, looking through the technical regulations for the 2017 Formula One cars, and this is 103 pages of everything that makes an F1 car an F1 car. Only a single section, which must be open, may be contained within any longitudinal longitudinal vertical cross-section taken parallel to the car with the car center plane and more than 125 behind the reference plane. Any parts of the car less than 100 mm contents at a constant pressure no less than 10 seconds and no more millimeters in length and width, or may not be less than 10,000 millimeters below this point. So the teams pour through these technical regulations and design the fastest car they can. Because it's all open, it has to be really specific what you can design and where. And here on the other hand, I have the technical regulations for the 2017 Formula 2 cars, which is just a paltry 13 pages in length. Feeder series like Formula 2, GP3, or Formula Renault 2.0 have much less complicated regulations because they exist as a junior series to Formula 1, and a lot of the development of the cars and engines is closed and not open like Formula 1 regulations. The purpose of the feeder formulas is to create a ladder for young drivers and engineers to train with the goal of reaching Formula 1, and also to go racing, of course. The Formula Racing Pyramid is a way of visualizing all the different F1 feeder series. At the top, the pinnacle is Formula 1. One step down are the highly competitive global series like Formula 2 and Formula V8 3.5. The next tier has series that are running globally and regionally, for instance series that just run in Europe, like GP3 and FIA-sanctioned Formula 3 series. Further down are regional and national series, like the Formula Renault 2.0 and other non-FIA Formula 3 series. Below that are series like Formula 1.6 and Formula 4, and then at the ground level are various national, regional, and global karting series, which is a whole other can of worms. Formula 1 is the top tier, the pinnacle, obviously, and it's easy enough to grasp then that Formula 2 is a step down. But then we mix in GP3, Formula V8 3.5, and it's just a mishmash of constantly changing series that sometimes go defunct due to rising cost or lack of interest, or both. This is complicated even further by some drivers who jump a few rungs of the ladder, like Max Verstappen, who jumped from the European Formula 3 Championship to F1 in 2015. The lower series race weekends are set up a bit differently than a Formula 1 weekend, having fewer practice sessions and multiple, shorter races. Their calendars are shorter and mostly constrained to particular regions. For instance, the FIA Formula 3 European Championship only takes place on European circuits, or they might be constrained to nations, like the Italian F4 Championship. Of course, there are certain series that use the same cars, but are more competitive or prestigious. One final note, not all the series are sanctioned by the FIA, but those that are tend to be more prestigious. Let's talk race weekends.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second round of the 2017 Formula 2 Championship. Cars already out on the circuit. As you can tell, it is noon here, and this is the only practice session they have available to them this weekend.
For a typical lower Formula example, we'll use Formula 2. This year's calendar has 11 tracks to visit from April to November as the series follows the F1 teams around Europe and a couple of tracks in the Middle East. When commentators speak of support races, they're talking about these guys. Cars get out on track on Friday in between the main sessions. There's a free practice session that the teams use to shake down the car and get a setup right for the track. Then in the afternoon, a qualifying session. This qualifying is an open format, with a set time for cars to get out on track and set the fastest lap they can, as opposed to the knockout format F1 runs. The pole sitter is awarded championship points, 4 in the case of Formula 2. Qualifying determines the grid for Saturday's feature race, the first of an F2 weekend's 2 races. The feature race is run on Saturday afternoon, and, for Formula 2, is 180 kilometers long, but lengths vary for each series. They usually work out to be about an hour long. During the race, drivers are compelled to take one pit stop and run both compounds of tire available for the weekend. Pirelli supplies 4 compounds for Formula 2, from super soft to hard, and designates 2 compounds for each weekend. Of course, other series have different tire regulations and might only have 1 compound available at a time. Points are awarded for the feature race to the top 10 drivers with the same scoring scheme as F1. 25 points for first, 18 for second, and so on. Points are also awarded to the driver who sets the fastest lap, which is pretty common across all series, and something that's been debated being introduced to Formula 1. On Sunday morning, the cars run in the sprint race, which for F2 is 2/3 the length of the feature race. The big shakeup here is a reverse order grid. The top 8 finishers for the feature race start in reverse order, so the driver who finished 8th on Saturday will start from pole position, and the winner will start from 8th place, with 9th on down starting in their respective finishing position. Points are awarded to the top 8 finishers, with the first gaining 15 points, second 12, third 10, and so on. Another 2 points are on offer for the driver that sets the fastest lap and finishes in the top 10. This is a race weekend format that's generally followed for all lower formulas, of course with some having different points allowance, different qualifying structure, or pit stop rules. Almost all series support a larger racing series, with Formula 2 and GP3 supporting Formula 1, Formula V8 3.5 supporting WEC, and others supporting series like DTM. This provides an extra incentive to come to those big races, and logistically makes sense for race promoters. Now, let's get down and dirty with each series and talk about the cars, drivers, and level of racing. One of the most important feeder series is Formula 2. F2 is the closest to F1 in terms of cars and talent, and will be even more so next year with a brand new 2018 car featuring a new V6 turbo engine to replace the current V8, as well as a new aerodynamic package with lower, wider rear wings and a swept front wing that mimics this year's F1 cars. But we'll get to the cars in just a moment. The name Formula 2 has been around since the beginning of the FIA-sanctioned World Championships in the 50s. F2 cars actually ran for the World Drivers' Championship in 52 and 3 due to a lack of F1 entries. The series was replaced in the 80s by Formula 3000, and then revived again in 2009, only to then go defunct after the 2012 season due to a lack of entries. And this year, the name Formula 2 is actually new. The FIA just rebranded the GP2 series, which was started in 2005 by Bernie Ecclestone and Flavio Briatore for the 2017 season. And herein lies one of the core issues of the various tiers of feeder series. It's so difficult for the novice viewer to understand what level of racing each tier is. But let's get back to business, the cars.
Worldly wise, I realize that everybody's crazy.
The 2017 F2 car has been in service for quite some time, going back to the 2011 GP2 season. The chassis has all the safety features you'd find on an F1 car, and is constructed in much the same way, with a carbon fiber and aluminum honeycomb monocoque, carbon bodywork, air devices, and so on. However, F2 is a single manufacturer spec series, in that all the cars are produced by one manufacturer, Dallara. That name's familiar because they produce a lot of racing cars, with the Italian firm currently designing and building cars for IndyCar, Indy Lights, GP3, Formula E, World Series by Renault, Formula 2, as well as a few others. Dallara even had a stint as an F1 constructor in the 80s and 90s, and have designed F1 cars for Midland and later Jordan in the mid-2000s, Hispania in 2010, and most recently partnered with Haas to design and build the VF16 and VF17 contenders. The moral of the story being that Dallara has a quasi-monopoly on the spec racing car market. The GP211, which will run its last race in November in Abu Dhabi, costs teams approximately 1.5 to 2 million euros per car per year, which includes pretty much everything except the engine. These cars are powered by a spec 4-liter V8 producing around 600 horsepower, which is manufactured by Mechachrome, who is closely intertwined with Renault. Since Mechachrome is the sole manufacturer of engines for F2, they can focus on reliability and cost-effectiveness instead of maximizing performance based on a blank check. An engine will run teams about 150,000 euros and will last for around 4,000 kilometers before needing a rebuild. Other parts on F2 cars include Brembo carbon brakes, a Hewland 6-speed semi-automatic gearbox, Pirelli tires, and a steel pushrod suspension. The tires are much skinnier than this year's F1 tires, meaning these cars have less mechanical grip than their big brothers. Overall, this year's F2 car is about 15% slower than the 2017 F1 cars, depending on the track, of course. But that gap is likely to fall with next year's cars. The main focus of Formula 2 cars, and all spec series for that matter, is to keep costs at a minimum and ensure an even playing field for teams and drivers. This allows drivers' skills to show through and give F1 teams a chance to pick and develop talent.
In the hole, and nothing left to burn. I'd love to run out now. There's no way left to turn. No. With a car.
On that note, there have been a lot of drivers to come through GP2/F2 with names that you'd recognize. Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton, Stoffel Van Dorn, Nico Hulkenberg. They all raced in the series, and most even won the championship. In total, about 17% of all drivers in GP2/Formula 2 have gone on to race in F1, 30 out of 174. Current GP2 graduates in F1 are Ericsson, Grosjean, Hamilton, Hulkenberg, Palmer, Perez, and Van Dorn. The 2017 season has seen a number of promising drivers as well. Charles Leclerc leads the championship, is a member of the Ferrari Driving Academy, and has been on pole for all but 2 races up until round 9. He started by racing karts, then graduated to Formula Renault 2.0, and then on to Formula 3, claimed the GP3 title in 2016, and now races for Prima Power Team in F2. Although he's only 19 years old, Leclerc has shown a lot of promise. He seems to be the heir apparent to Kimi's Ferrari seat, and has done some testing for Ferrari and Haas, but with all the seats filled at those teams for 2018, he might not be in for an F1 drive next year. Artem Markelov has proven to be a competent driver this year, currently in third place in the standings after placing mid-pack since 2014. However, being 23 years old and having no serious testing or developmental relationship with F1 teams, graduating doesn't seem likely for the Russian. That's the tragedy for a lot of drivers in the lower formulas. Their careers can peak due to not being connected enough or not showing pace when they need to. The same can be said for Ollie Rowland, who's been racing in the series since 2015 and is clearly a quick driver, winning the Formula Renault 3.5 series in 2015 and currently running second in the championship. But his time horizon has passed, and will likely never move past being a test driver for the Renault F1 team. Another Renault Sport Academy driver is the Swiss Louis Delatraz, who, by the way, has a great racing car driver name. He's been performing poorly this year, falling behind his racing engineering teammate Gustav Malya, but he has the Renault connection. He is only 20, his father raced in F1 and later sports cars, so if his performance improves, he might be in for an F1 drive. The fact is that there are only 20 or so F1 seats, and with drivers racing well into their 30s, it takes a great deal of luck, skill, and connections to make it in the top tier and stay there. Just being fast doesn't guarantee anything. Formula 2 races, and all the lower formula for that matter, are a lot of fun to watch. Because the cars are so similar and the drivers are mostly competitive, there's always a lot of battles going on up and down the field. Reduced power means drivers have to make up speed through the corners, and reduced downforce and mechanical grip makes the cars looser through them. Drivers' inexperience means that there tend to be more accidents, which can make for exciting safety car restarts, and camera operators tend to be creative with their shots, which at least I like. Finally, they're about half the length of an F1 race, so you don't have to dedicate a lot of time to watching it. And as an added bonus, the races are a lot easier to find and watch if you happen to miss them. The management doesn't pay as close attention to taking down past races as they do with F1, and a lot of series will stream the races live for free and post to video sharing sites after their run. I think a big reason for Formula 2 and lower tiers lacking the viewers that F1 draws, despite arguably being more exciting racing, is the lack of drama that the series carries. That's a big reason F1 is so prestigious in the first place. Even in comparison to WEC or IndyCar, it's the tabloid nature of news and personal drama from the sport. It's just something lower formulas don't have time for. They're just here to go racing. World Series Formula V8 3.5. Formula 2's closest competitor in terms of cars and drivers is organized by RPM Comunicación and used to be part of the Renault Sport Series before they pulled their funding for it in 2015. This year it functions as a support series to the World Endurance Championship, hitting most of the tracks on their calendar as well as a few others. The cars in Formula V8 have a Dallara-designed and produced chassis, the T12, which has been in use since 2012. It has all the trappings of a Formula 2 racer, a carbon fiber monocoque, pushrod suspension, and an F1-style DRS system. I couldn't find a cost figure for one car, but the Dallara IndyCar chassis, which was designed and produced in the same year, is said to cost about $350,000 US, so that might give some insight. The cars are powered by a 3.4-liter Zytec V8 in use since 2012, which produces 530 horsepower, about 70 less than the F2 cars, and it runs on Michelin tires. These cars are some of my personal favorites of the lower formulas as far as looks are concerned, with wavy front wings and aggressive-looking gills in the side pods. Formula V8 races are a bit different, with 2 qualifying sessions on Saturday and Sunday for their respective races, which is a timed 40-minute session. Drivers are compelled to do a pit stop in the second race, and points are awarded equally for both races, following the F1 format. This year, the series has lost a few teams from competition, with only 6 teams entering 12 cars. A number of notable drivers switched series as well, like the 2016 runner-up Louis Delatraz, who we've already reviewed in Formula 2. This doesn't bode well for the series, as losing entries is how a lot of racing championships have folded in the past, and with the lack of Renault funding, it might just fold in the coming years. It's a shame to see this series struggling, since it's graduated so many great drivers in the past, with a few dozen making it to Formula One, like Sebastian Vettel, Robert Kubica, and most recently Pierre Gasly. One series that certainly isn't struggling this year and has had some great races is GP3. The GP3 series is the next step down from Formula 2 and has sent a lot of talent up to F1. Drivers like Valtteri Bottas, Esteban Ocon, and Kvyat have all won the GP3 championship and later moved into F1. It was started in 2010 as a stepping stone for drivers into GP2. GP3 is very similar in structure to Formula 2, but with the volume turned down by about a third. So imagine this is Formula 1 up here, and then Formula 2 is right around here, and we fall into GP3 just here. The calendar visits 7 locations in 2017 in support of Formula 1 and 2, and this season, 6 teams have entered 20 cars. The cars were new for 2016 and, as you guessed, are designed and manufactured by Dallara. The GP316 chassis has less aero features than their bigger brothers, the GP211, and are powered by smaller 3.5-liter Mechachrome V6s that produce around 400 horsepower, about 2/3 of the Formula 2 V8s. To give you an idea on cornering performance, GP3 cars pull a maximum of 2.6 G through a corner, F2 3.5 G, and then the 2017 F1s over 6 G. These cars are about 5 to 10% slower around a track than a Formula 2 car. Again, we'll have all the comparison graphics between the Formula series on our Twitter and Instagram. It's a lot easier to understand these differences visually than audibly. GP3 cars also run on Pirelli tires, but with only 3 compounds developed for the series. They have a 6-speed sequential gearbox and DRS just like their larger counterparts. Race weekends follow the same format as F2. Friday practice and an open qualifying session with 4 points awarded to the pole sitter. Saturday's feature race is to run no longer than 40 minutes with points awarded to the top 10 finishers, 1 point on offer for the fastest lap. The sprint race is a maximum of 30 minutes and starts a reverse order grid from the top 8 finishers of the feature race. This year's GP3 season has been great to follow along with the top 5 drivers all pretty close on points, and the top 2, George Russell and Jack Aitken, the future of British motorsport, edging out a bit further from the others. And they've had some fantastic intra-team battles like the one we heard at the beginning of the episode from the Monza feature race. GP3 races contain a lot of excitement too. Drivers are even more inexperienced, which means more mistakes and battling. Sometimes F1 races can be so prescriptive because all the drivers are so talented and experienced, plus they're racing with a lot of other motivations, whereas lower Formula drivers are battling for their career survival. For the future, George Russell is a name we're likely to hear a lot more often. He is a Mercedes junior driver and has tested in the F1 car this year at Budapest. Aitken is a member of the Renault F1 junior program, so he's likely to move up in his career as well, provided Renault maintains their commitment to Formula 1. One other familiar name is Giuliano Alesi, son of Jean Alesi, who is just 18 years old and a member of Ferrari's junior program. Alas, these drivers face the same uncertainty as all other junior drivers. Even though they have the connections, there's no guarantee that they'll progress into a top-tier F1 spot. Take the current situation with Robert Kubica flirting with a few teams, a driver who is comparatively old to these guys and has come back from a major reconstructive surgery, being regarded harder than the younger talent in junior programs.
How about we move away from all the hollow wells? I know we could.
I've never been to a Grand Prix before.
You still haven't. This is Formula 3.
What's that?
That's a lower division, where idiots like me mess about in the hope of being talent spotted to race in Formula 1. You look disappointed.
Formula 3 competes at the same level as GP3, albeit with a bit less attention paid to the series. This is where things get complicated because as we move further down the open-wheeled racing pyramid, more and more series pop up. GP3 cars are considered third tier, but I would rank the GP3 series as being top of that pile, with a lot of drivers coming up through GP3 to F2 as opposed to moving from a Formula 3 or 4 up. Formula 3 cars are used in a number of different series around the globe, and at this point the series started to become regional, or even limited to a country. The FIA sets technical regulations for Formula 3 cars, which are produced by Dallara and a few other manufacturers. Then different sanctioning bodies around the world run Formula 3 series. The FIA sanctions a European Championship, there's a Brazilian Championship, the All-Japan Championship, and more. The Formula 3 regulations dictate certain specifications for the chassis and engine, which can then be manufactured by anyone. This is different to F2 or GP3, who have a single manufacturer. The majority of chassis run in all the different championships are the Dallara F317, but a Russian firm, Artline, also produces some cars. Engines are also open to produce. As long as they're a 2-liter, 4-cylinder engine, they're eligible. They produce around 240 horsepower and have a maximum cost of 65,000 euros. There are many more engine manufacturers out there than chassis manufacturers, including Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, Renault, and a few various Japanese firms. There are a ton of F3 championships, and I won't bore you with all of them, but the most prestigious is the FIA sanctioned European Championship. This is a highly competitive series with 5 teams fielding 23 cars which race 30 times over the season. 3 races per weekend, 3 qualifying sessions. These drivers get a lot of work. Plenty of F1 drivers have come through Formula 3 as well, including Lance Stroll, Max Verstappen, and Esteban Ocon. Below the mini Formula 3 series are even more Formula 4 series, as well as Formula Renault 2.0 and 1.6. Competitions that are designed as the first open-wheeled series that young drivers will enter after graduating from karting championships. For Formula 4, costs are kept as low as possible, with a rolling chassis running just 33,000 euros, and engines 9,500 euros. There are quite a few chassis manufacturers as well as engine makers, producing the 4-cylinder 160 brake horsepower units. There are also a ton of young drivers racing in these series. In the Eurocup Formula Renault 2.0 alone, there have been 32 racers this year, with 30 races on the calendar. The design is meant to get these guys racing as much as possible at the lowest cost, so the drivers can get a grip on open-wheeled cars with a little bit of downforce, and let consistency and speed shine through.
Every step is moving me up. Every step is moving me up.
Suffice it to say, there are a lot of racing series that funnel drivers into Formula 1. Not to mention many other of the top-tier racing series like IndyCar, WEC, DTM, and so on. It can be difficult to keep up with all the racing, and this year I've been paying attention to Formula 2 and GP3 more than others. The replays are always really easy to catch, and the racing has almost always been above average. Also, at least until the end of this season, Formula 2 cars sound much better than the new wave F1s. If you're a fan of motorsport and love watching racing, but are feeling unfulfilled by watching some of the big shows, I encourage you to check out some of these lower tiers. It might just be worth your time. Thanks for listening to this episode. We'll be back next week with a track walk segment for the US GP at Circuit of the Americas, and then in part 2 of this series, we'll talk about how a driver can make it into Formula 1. If you feel we're worth it, please subscribe to Garagista Radio wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have the time, rate us to know how we can do better. We'll see you here next time. Thanks again.